27 million people saw it. They walked through it, touched it, called it heaven on earth. And then, within less than a year, it was erased so completely, we're still arguing if it even made sense to begin with. It didn't start as a mystery. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden revelation, just a quiet search through old records. The kind of research you expect to finish in an afternoon and forget by evening. Construction logs, engineering notes, late 19th century building methods. The goal was simple: understand how people built large structures before modern machinery existed. That was it. But then, a pattern began to form. A name kept appearing again and again across unrelated documents. Chicago, 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition. At first, it meant nothing, just another historical event, another line in the archives. Until the numbers started to feel wrong. 200 buildings, 686 acres, constructed in under 2 years, and then demolished within months. It didn't register immediately. The numbers were read once, then again, then a third time. Not because they were confusing, but because they didn't make sense. This wasn't just a large project. It was, by every available metric, one of the largest coordinated construction efforts in human history at that time. And it was built on a swamp. Jackson Park, Chicago. In 1891, it wasn't a construction site. It was unstable, land waterlogged, uneven, completely unsuitable for massive architecture. And yet, within 28 months, more than 40,000 workers transformed it into something visitors would later call the White City. A place so grand, so unreal, that people struggled to describe it without sounding like they were exaggerating. But they weren't exaggerating. If anything, they were underselling it. At the center of it all stood a structure so large that even contemporary engineers had trouble explaining it. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, 1,687 feet long, 787 feet wide, 44 acres of interior space. To put that into perspective, entire city blocks could fit inside it. Cathedrals could sit within its entrance halls and still leave space unused. It was larger than St. Peter's Basilica, larger than the Roman Colosseum multiple times over. And it wasn't alone. Nearly 200 structures of similar architectural ambition surrounded it, forming a city that looked less like something built and more like something revealed. And then there was the timeline. That's where the story begins to break. Because these weren't crude buildings. They weren't simple wooden frames or temporary tents. They were massive, symmetrical, classically designed structures, columns, domes, facades, modeled after ancient Rome and Greece. The kind of architecture that, even today, requires precision, planning, and time. A lot of time, but in this case, they weren't given years. They were given months. The official explanation is simple. Too simple. The buildings were temporary, constructed from a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber, designed to look like marble, designed to impress, but never meant to last. Essentially, a giant stage set, a beautiful illusion, a city built not to endure, but to be seen, and then forgotten. But the more the records were examined, the less that explanation held up, because something didn't align. Not the scale, not the infrastructure, not the effort. You don't build something that large, something that complex just to throw it away. At least not without a reason. And there was no clear reason. Then came the witnesses. 27 million people. Nearly half the population of the United States at the time. They traveled for days by train, by carriage, on foot just to see it. And when they did, they didn't describe it as temporary. They didn't describe it as fragile. They described it as impossible. Letters from visitors spoke of overwhelming light, of buildings that seemed too perfect, too clean, too massive to be real. Some called it a dream. Others called it heaven, not metaphorically, but literally, as if they had stepped into something that didn't belong to their time. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. That was the part that wouldn't let go. Not the construction, not the beauty, but the disappearance. Because things like that don't just vanish. Not without leaving something behind. Not without questions. The records say it was dismantled, that the materials were salvaged, that the buildings were never meant to last in the first place. But those explanations felt incomplete. Like reading the last page of a story without ever seeing the beginning. So the question changed. It was no longer, how did they build it? It became something else entirely. Something heavier. something harder to ignore. If it was only temporary, why did everything about it feel permanent? And more importantly, what exactly did 27 million people witness that we were never meant to fully understand? That was the moment it stopped being research and became something else, a trail, a pattern, a question that didn't want to be answered, but refused to disappear. If the White City was truly temporary, then everything about it was designed in the most permanent way possible. That contradiction is where the illusion begins to crack. At a distance, the official story sounds reasonable. A grand exhibition, decorative buildings, a showcase of progress. But when you step closer, when you examine the details, the scale becomes harder to dismiss. This wasn't decoration. This was infrastructure. Beneath the surface of the fairgrounds, something far less glamorous was installed. 56 miles of sewer lines. Not symbolic, not decorative, functional. Engineered to manage waste for a city-sized population. No one installs that kind of system for a structure meant to last 6 months. No one invests that level of effort just for appearance. Above ground, the contradiction deepened. Electricity. Not a few lights for show, but an entire grid. Over 100,000 incandescent bulbs illuminated the grounds. Nearly 5,000 arc lamps lit the massive exhibition halls. At a time when most homes in America had never seen electric light, this place didn't just use electricity. It overwhelmed it. 12 massive generators powered the system. Together, they produced 3 times the electricity used by the entire city of Chicago at that time. Think about that. A temporary fair, consuming more power than the city hosting it. Visitors didn't describe it as, well, lit. They described it as something unnatural, a glow that turned night into day, a brightness so intense, some believed it wasn't just technology, but something closer to magic. And at the center of it all stood a man whose presence would only deepen the mystery, Nikola Tesla. The 1893 World's Fair wasn't just about architecture. It was the battlefield where the War of the Currents reached its climax. Thomas Edison had made his bid direct current, but it was Tesla's system, backed by George Westinghouse, that won. Alternating current, more efficient, more scalable, more powerful. When Westinghouse secured the contract, something unexpected happened. Edison refused to allow the use of his light bulbs. So in response, Westinghouse manufactured 250,000 brand new bulbs in just a few months. At the time, that represented nearly a quarter of all the bulbs ever produced in human history. All of them. For this one event. On opening night, May 1st, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a single button, and instantly, 100,000 lights ignited at once. Witnesses didn't clap. They froze. Some said it felt like witnessing the future. Others said it felt like witnessing something they weren't meant to understand. Tesla himself had a dedicated exhibit. Inside, he demonstrated concepts that would sound advanced even today. Wireless lighting, rotating magnetic fields, high-voltage experiments reaching millions of volts. People watched bulbs glow without wires. They watched energy move through space itself. Not theory, not speculation, demonstration. And then, just like everything else, it disappeared. The buildings that housed these experiments were torn down, the systems dismantled, the momentum lost. Tesla's more ambitious ideas would later be defunded, dismissed, or quietly abandoned. And that raises a question no one seems eager to answer. Why demonstrate world-changing technology inside a city that was never meant to survive? Because nothing about this makes sense if you accept the premise of temporary. Temporary buildings don't require permanent electrical grids. Temporary exhibitions don't need industrial-scale power generation. Temporary showcases don't push the limits of science beyond what the world is ready for. Unless that was never the real purpose. Because when you step back, a pattern begins to form. A city built at impossible speed, powered by technology ahead of its time, witnessed by millions, then dismantled before it could be studied, questioned, or understood. It's not just the scale that's unsettling. It's the intention. Who builds something like this, only to destroy it? Who installs infrastructure that rivals entire cities, for something meant to last less than a year? Who gathers the most advanced minds of the time to demonstrate breakthroughs, and then erases the stage they stood on? The official story calls it spectacle, a temporary display of progress. But spectacle doesn't explain the investment, it doesn't explain the precision, and it definitely doesn't explain the disappearance. Because if this was just a show, it was the most elaborate, most expensive, and most unnecessary illusion ever created. Or it wasn't an illusion at all. And that possibility, the one no one can quite prove, but no one can fully dismiss, begins to take shape here. In the lights, in the wires, in the silent hum of generators that powered something far greater than a fair, something that looked less like a temporary city and more like a glimpse of a world that wasn't supposed to last. By this point, the question was no longer what happened. It was, how much of it actually made sense? Because once you accept the scale of the White City, you're forced to confront something uncomfortable. The explanation given doesn't match the reality described. Let's start with the timeline. January 1891 construction begins. May 1893 the fair opens. 28 months. That's all the time they had to transform unstable swampland into the largest coordinated architectural project of its era. No modern cranes, no heavy machinery, no power tools as we understand them today. Just manpower, basic equipment, and horse-drawn transport. 40,000 workers. That number sounds impressive until you break it down. Because even with that workforce, the logistics don't add up. Think about what had to happen. Steel had to be produced at scale, transported without modern infrastructure, assembled with precision. Massive arch trusses, hundreds of feet wide, had to be lifted and placed into position with near-perfect accuracy. Not once, but repeatedly. Where are the foundry records? Where are the transport logs? Where is the documentation showing how materials of that volume were moved, shaped, and assembled in such a short time? There are photographs, yes. Workers standing beside rising structures, frameworks appearing out of empty ground, buildings taking form. But even those images feel strange, not staged, not fake, just too fast. As if something is missing between the frames. Contemporary writers felt it too. One visitor described walking through the construction site in 1892. He didn't talk about noise, or chaos, or the frantic energy you would expect from a project of that magnitude. He described something else. Silence, a stillness that didn't belong, and structures that felt, in his words, theatrically unreal. That phrase lingers, because it captures something subtle but important. Not that the buildings were fake, but that they felt out of place. Like they didn't belong to the process that supposedly created them. And that's where the alternative explanations begin to surface. Not because people are looking for conspiracy, but because the official story leaves gaps too large to ignore. One theory suggests something radically different, that the buildings weren't constructed at all, that they were already there. According to this idea, the White City wasn't built from scratch. It was revealed, excavated, restored, cleaned, painted, presented as new. The theory connects to a broader concept, often referred to as a lost or erased civilization, a world that existed before the current historical timeline fully took shape, a world whose structures massive, advanced, and misunderstood were later repurposed, rebranded, and eventually removed. It sounds extreme. It should, but the reason it persists is simple. It attempts to answer questions the official narrative avoids. Because if these buildings were truly temporary, why do they resemble ancient architecture so precisely? Why the columns, the domes, the symmetry? Why replicate Rome and Greece on such a massive scale, only to destroy it months later? And more importantly, why does the speed of construction seem almost impossible, even by modern standards? 2 years is barely enough time today to complete projects far smaller in scope. Yet in the 1890s, without modern technology, they supposedly achieved something greater, faster, cleaner, more precise. At some point, the explanation begins to strain. Not collapse, but stretch thin enough that light starts to pass through. The more you examine it, the more it feels like you're looking at two overlapping stories. One official, one implied. The official story says, they built it. Quickly, efficiently, brilliantly. Then they tore it down because it was never meant to last. The implied story whispers something else. That what people saw in 1893 was not entirely new. And if that's true, then the question shifts again. It's no longer about construction. It's about origin. Where did these designs come from? Where did the knowledge come from? And why does it appear fully formed, fully realized only to vanish just as quickly? Because patterns begin to emerge, not just in Chicago, but across multiple world fairs of that era. Massive neoclassical cities, built rapidly, displayed to millions, then systematically dismantled, always temporary, always explained away, always gone before the next generation can question it. And yet, one detail refuses to fit the pattern. One exception that complicates everything, because not everything was destroyed, not everything disappeared. One building remained, and its existence would prove something undeniable. They didn't just know how to build temporary illusions, they knew how to build things that could last. Which raises the most dangerous question yet. If they could build it to survive, why did they choose not to? If the White City was only a temporary illusion, then its disappearance should have been ordinary, planned, orderly, expected. But it wasn't. Because what happened after the fair closed didn't look like dismantling. It looked like eradication. October 30th, 1893. The fair ends. Not with celebration, but with disruption. Just 2 days before the official closing ceremony, the mayor of Chicago is assassinated. The atmosphere shifts. What was meant to be a grand finale ends abruptly, quietly, almost as if something had interrupted the script. And then the countdown begins. Not to preservation, not to study, but to disappearance. Within weeks, sections of the fairgrounds begin to fall silent. Workers leave. Structures stand untouched. No major effort is made to document the full extent of what had been built. No comprehensive preservation plans are executed, but something else begins instead. Fire. January 8th, 1894. Just over 2 months after the fair closes, a massive fire breaks out. It starts in one building, then spreads. Quickly, aggressively, almost strategically, the flames move through the court of honor. They consume the grand facades. They reach the casino, the music hall, and eventually, they strike the heart of it all. Witnesses gather, not to stop it, but to watch. More than 20,000 people stand in the cold, staring as the White City burns. The same city they once walked through in awe, now collapsing in fire and smoke. One newspaper describes it as the greatest pyrotechnic display of the fair. That wording feels wrong. Not tragic, not devastating, but theatrical, as if even in destruction, it was still performing. And then come the details that don't quite fit. Reports of multiple fire attempts before the main blaze. 3 separate incidents targeting the agricultural building. Guards claiming they saw figures moving at night, lighting matches, then disappearing through trapdoors. Trapdoors. In temporary buildings, the fire doesn't behave randomly. It spreads with direction. From the casino, along the main structures, jumping distances that shouldn't have been possible so quickly. This wasn't just a fire, it was a chain reaction, and whether intentional or not, it accelerated something already in motion. Because here's what complicates everything. The demolition had already been planned. Contracts had been signed before the fire, which means the destruction wasn't a response to the fire. The fire was simply a faster way to achieve it. Within 9 months, almost nothing remains. The steel is stripped and sold for scrap. The plaster facades crumble. The foundations are cleared. The land is returned to silence. What was once called the greatest architectural achievement of its time is reduced to fragments, ash, memory. And then, even the memory begins to fade. But not everything disappears. One structure survives, the Palace of Fine Arts. Unlike the others, it wasn't built entirely from temporary materials. It used brick, steel, fireproof construction. It was designed to protect valuable artworks from around the world, because other nations refused to display their masterpieces in buildings that might burn. So for this one building, they made an exception, and that exception changes everything, because it proves something undeniable. They had the capability to build permanent structures. The materials existed, the knowledge existed, the techniques existed, and yet they chose not to apply it to the rest. Or perhaps they did. And what we're told were temporary buildings were never meant to be temporary at all. The palace still stands today, over a century later, solid, enduring, real, which raises a question that becomes harder to ignore with each passing detail. If they could build one structure to last, why destroy everything else? Because destruction takes effort, planning, resources, intent. And when something is erased this thoroughly, it's rarely accidental. It's deliberate. The White City didn't simply disappear. It was removed. Systematically, efficiently, completely. And just as the physical structures vanished, something else began to take their place. A different story, a darker one. 3 miles away from the fairgrounds, a man named H. Holmes operates a building that will later be called a castle of horrors. Disappearances, murder, secret rooms, sensational headlines. The media shifts, the narrative changes. Suddenly, the focus isn't on what was built or what was lost. It's on fear, crime, shock. The White City becomes a backdrop, a setting, a footnote, and the question lingers, quietly, almost unnoticed beneath the noise. Was the horror story the real headline, or just a distraction from something far bigger? Because while the world looked in one direction, something extraordinary was being erased in another, and by the time anyone thought to look back, there was nothing left to see. In the end, nothing was left. No skyline, no monuments, no towering domes reflecting light across the water. Just empty ground. And that's what makes this story so difficult to ignore. Because absence, true absence, isn't neutral. It's shaped, defined, almost intentional. The White City didn't fade away slowly. It didn't decay over decades like most great structures do. It didn't become ruins, studied and preserved. It was there, fully realized, fully witnessed. And then it was gone. And yet, something about it refused to disappear. Photographs remained. Black and white images of impossible symmetry. Massive columns. Endless halls. Crowds of people standing beneath structures that, even today, would be difficult to replicate at that scale in such a short time. 27 million people saw it. They walked its streets. They touched its walls. They stood under lights so bright they described them as unnatural. They knew what they had witnessed. And still, over time, the memory softened. The story simplified. It became a temporary fair, a collection of decorative buildings, a beautiful but fleeting moment in history. But the deeper you look, the more that version feels incomplete, because patterns begin to emerge, not just in Chicago, but across an entire era. Cities burn, then rise again more magnificent than before. Grand structures appear, displayed briefly, celebrated, then dismantled, again and again and again. It's easy to call it coincidence. Easier to accept that each event stands alone, that each destruction has its own explanation. But patterns don't form from randomness. They form from repetition, from intent. And this pattern of creation, display, and erasure repeats with unsettling precision. The timing matters. The White City appears in 1893, just decades after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, a disaster that leveled the city, destroying over 17,000 buildings and leaving tens of thousands homeless. 22 years later, on land that was once unstable, damaged, and unsuitable, the most ambitious construction project of its time emerges. We're told this is resilience, innovation, human progress, and maybe it is. But when that progress is erased just as quickly as it appears, the story begins to shift. Because progress is usually preserved, studied, built upon. It doesn't vanish. And yet, here, it did. The technologies demonstrated at the fair didn't immediately transform the world. Tesla's experiments, wireless energy, advanced electrical systems faded into obscurity. Funding disappeared. Momentum stalled. The buildings that housed those ideas, gone. The infrastructure that powered them, dismantled. The largest enclosed structure ever built at the time, burned, scrapped, forgotten, and in its place, a narrative that feels smaller, safage, easier to accept. Because if you accept the official version, everything fits neatly. It was temporary. It served its purpose. And then it ended. But if you don't, if you allow even a small amount of doubt, then the questions begin to multiply. How do you build something that massive in under 2 years without modern tools? Why demonstrate technology so advanced, only to bury it? Why does the one surviving building prove permanence was possible, while everything else was destroyed? Why did fires conveniently erase what demolition had not yet removed? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why do we remember the horror stories more clearly than we remember what was actually built? Because H. Holmes became the legend, the killer, the monster tied to the fair. Books were written about him, documentaries focused on him. His story grew, while the White City itself shrank in memory. And that imbalance feels deliberate, not because the crimes weren't real, but because they became the focus, the distraction, something to look at, while something else was quietly forgotten. because forgetting doesn't always happen by accident. Sometimes it's guided. The witnesses are gone now. The letters they wrote sit in archives. The photographs fade with time. And the physical proof, the buildings themselves, no longer exist. All that remains is the outline of something missing, a gap in history shaped exactly like the White City. And gaps like that don't appear without cause. They are created, maintained, protected. So what was erased? Was it simply a temporary exhibition, built with extraordinary effort and then removed as planned? Or was it something else? Something older, something misunderstood, something that didn't fit the version of history that came after it? There are no definitive answers. Not yet. But the questions remain, persistent, unresolved, impossible to fully dismiss. Because once you see the pattern, once you notice the speed, the scale, the disappearance, you can't unsee it. The White City existed. That much is certain. Millions of people saw it, touched it, stood inside it. And yet today, we're left debating not just how it was built, but why it was erased so completely. And maybe that's the point. Not to leave behind answers, but to leave behind just enough evidence to make the absence impossible to ignore. Because sometimes what's missing tells you more than what remains. And the White City, in all its vanished grandeur, might be one of the clearest examples of that truth. A city that appeared like a vision, burned like a spectacle, and disappeared like it was never meant to be remembered, leaving behind only one final question. Kie, persist, and impossible to silence. What else have we been taught to forget? In the end, not everything was lost. The buildings may be gone. The lights may have faded. The voices of those 27 million witnesses long silent. But something still remains, not in stone, not in steel, but in questions that refuse to die. Because history isn't just what survives. It's also what we choose to keep looking at. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the ending changes. Because for over a century, the White City was treated like a footnote, a curiosity, a spectacle that came and went. But now, people are looking again, reading again, questioning again, not to prove a conspiracy, not to rewrite everything, but simply to understand. And that changes everything. Because once something is questioned, it is no longer forgotten. The photographs still exist. The records still exist. The single surviving building still stands, quietly defying the idea that everything had to disappear. And more importantly, the curiosity is coming back. People are asking, how was this possible? Why was it erased? What did they really build? Those questions are not weakness. They are not doubt. They are the beginning of awareness. And awareness is something that cannot be burned, cannot be demolished, cannot be erased. Maybe the White City was destroyed. Maybe the truth was buried. Maybe the full story will never be completely known. But the ending doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the present, to anyone willing to look closer, to think deeper, to refuse easy answers. Because every time someone asks, wait, how did they do that? A piece of that lost world comes back. Not physically, but mentally, conceptually. And sometimes that's how truth survives. Not in monuments, but in mints. So no, this isn't a story about something that was erased forever. It's a story about something that was almost forgotten, and is now slowly being remembered. And maybe that was never supposed to happen, but it is. And that means, whatever the White City truly was, it didn't disappear completely. It's still here, not in the ground, but in the question you're left with. What if we're just beginning to remember what they tried to make us forget?